In 1871, 18-year-old Clara Evans arrived at Blackwood Hall to work as a maid. Her family was desperately poor. Her father had died from illness, and her mother struggled to feed 5 children. Clara had no choice but to leave her village and find work. Blackwood Hall belonged to one of the wealthiest families in England. The servants worked from dawn until late at night, and Clara quickly learned that people like her were expected to remain invisible. One afternoon, while cleaning the family library, Clara met Henry Blackwood, the 24-year-old son of the estate owner. He was educated, charming, and destined to inherit a fortune. Clara immediately lowered her eyes and apologized for being in the room. But Henry smiled and told her she had done nothing wrong. Over the following months, he often found reasons to speak with her. He asked about her family, her dreams, and the life she had left behind. No gentleman had ever treated her with such kindness. Clara knew their friendship was dangerous. A wealthy gentleman and a servant girl could never have a future together. Yet she found herself waiting for every chance to see him. As summer turned to autumn, their meetings became more frequent. They walked through quiet gardens when no one was watching and exchanged letters that Clara kept hidden beneath her mattress. One evening, Henry took her hands and confessed that he loved her. Clara could hardly believe his words. He promised that one day they would marry and build a life together. He said he did not care about social class or his family's expectations. For the first time in her life, Clara felt hope. She imagined a future free from poverty and hardship. She trusted every promise he made. What Clara did not know was that powerful families often valued wealth more than love, and some promises were easier to make than to keep. As the months passed, Clara and Henry grew closer. Every stolen conversation made Clara believed more strongly in the future he had promised. He wrote her letters filled with affection and spoke often of the day they would leave Blackwood Hall behind. Clara knew that if anyone discovered their relationship, she would lose her position immediately. But she trusted Henry completely. One cold winter evening, Henry told her that his father had begun pressuring him to marry. Several wealthy families had daughters of suitable age, and Mr. Blackwood wanted an alliance that would strengthen the family's business interests. Henry laughed as he spoke about it and assured Clara that there was nothing to fear. He promised that he would never marry a woman he did not love. His confidence eased Clara's worries. She believed love would be enough to overcome the barriers between them. Then one afternoon, everything changed. Clara was summoned to the housekeeper's office. The woman sat behind her desk with a stern expression and informed Clara that her services were no longer required. No explanation was offered. Clara begged to know what she had done wrong, but the housekeeper simply told her to pack her belongings and leave before sunset. Shocked and terrified, Clara searched for Henry throughout the estate. She finally found him near the stables. His face was pale and troubled. Before she could speak, he confessed that his father had discovered their relationship. Mr. Blackwood had been furious. He had ordered Clara's dismissal and threatened to Henry if he continued seeing her. Clara waited for Henry to say they would run away together. She waited for him to repeat all the promises he had made. Instead, he lowered his eyes. He told her he needed time. He told her he could not lose everything. Clara felt as though the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. As she left Blackwood Hall carrying the same suitcase she had arrived with, Henry did not follow her. He stood in silence and watched her walk away. For the first time, Clara wondered whether love was weaker than wealth. Clara returned to her village with no money and no position. Her mother was relieved to see her. But Clara could not bring herself to explain everything that had happened. Each day she waited for a letter from Henry. She convinced herself that he only needed time to stand up to his father. Weeks passed, then months. No letter arrived. One morning, Clara traveled to the nearest town in search of work. As she walked past a newspaper stand, a headline caught her attention. The Blackwood family had announced the engagement of Henry Blackwood to Lady Victoria Sinclair, the daughter of a wealthy aristocrat. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. She bought the newspaper with her last coins and read every word. The article described the marriage as one of the most promising social unions of the season. It praised the wealth and status both families would gain. There was no mention of love. Clara returned home in silence. That evening she locked herself in her room and cried until dawn. Everything Henry had promised had been a lie. The future she had imagined no longer existed. A few weeks later, another problem appeared. Clara realized she was expecting a child. Fear overwhelmed her. In Victorian England, an unmarried pregnant woman faced judgment everywhere she went. Many employers would refuse to hire her. Neighbors whispered about such women. Some families even turned their daughters away in shame. Clara told her mother the truth. The older woman wept, but did not abandon her. Together they tried to find a solution, but there was little hope. Winter was approaching, money was running out, and Clara's condition would soon become impossible to hide. One evening she made a decision. She would travel to London. It was a vast city where thousands of people arrived every day. Perhaps there she could find work and build a new life before her child was born. As she packed her small suitcase once again, Clara looked at the newspaper announcement she had kept hidden for weeks. Henry Blackwood would soon marry a rich and respected lady. Meanwhile, the woman he had once sworn to love forever was leaving everything behind, with nothing but heartbreak and uncertainty. The distance between their worlds had never seemed greater. London was nothing like Clara had imagined. The city was crowded, noisy, and unforgiving. Thousands of people arrived every year searching for work, and many never found it. Clara rented a tiny room in a poor neighborhood, where several families shared the same building. The walls were damp, the streets were filthy, and food was expensive. She spent her days searching for employment, but every interview ended the same way. Employers noticed her growing pregnancy and politely turned her away. As the weeks passed, her savings disappeared. Some evenings, she ate only a piece of bread, so she could save money for the days ahead. The loneliness was almost as painful as the hunger. She had no friends in the city and no family nearby. Often she wondered whether Henry ever thought about her at all. One cold afternoon, Clara passed a newspaper stand and saw a large article about the upcoming Blackwood wedding. The ceremony would take place in one of the most beautiful churches in England. Wealthy guests from across the country were expected to attend. Clara stared at the article for several moments before forcing herself to walk away. The life she had once dreamed of now belonged to another woman. A few days later, Clara became ill while walking through the city. Weak from exhaustion and hunger, she collapsed near a charitable shelter run by church volunteers. When she opened her eyes, she found herself in a clean room with a warm blanket covering her. An older woman named Mrs. Whitmore sat beside her. She managed the shelter and spent her days helping women who had nowhere else to go. Clara expected judgment when she explained her situation, but none came. Mrs. Whitmore simply listened. For the first time since leaving Blackwood Hall, Clara felt that someone cared about her future. The shelter offered her a bed and simple work helping in the kitchen. The pay was small, but it was enough to survive. Months later, as snow covered the streets of London, Clara gave birth to a baby girl. She named her Grace, holding her daughter for the first time. Clara felt something she had not experienced in many months. Hope she still carried. The pain of betrayal, poverty, and disappointment, but now she had someone who depended on her completely. Looking into Grace's tiny face, Clara made a promise. No matter how difficult life became, her daughter would never know the heartbreak that had destroyed her own dreams. The years passed slowly. Clara worked tirelessly at the shelter while raising Grace. Life remained difficult, but they survived. Grace grew into a bright and curious little girl with dark hair and kind eyes that reminded Clara of someone she tried very hard to forget. Clara never spoke about Grace's father. Whenever the child asked questions, Clara simply said that her father lived far away and could not be with them. By the time Grace turned 6 years old, she could already read simple books and dreamed of becoming a teacher one day. Clara was proud of her daughter. She wanted Grace to have opportunities that had never existed for her. One autumn morning, Mrs. Whitmore approached Clara with unexpected news. A wealthy family in London was searching for a governess assistant for their young children. The position included better wages and a private room. It was a chance to improve their lives. Clara accepted immediately. The new position brought stability for the first time in years. Grace attended a small school nearby while Clara worked in the household. For a while it seemed that life was finally becoming easier. Then one afternoon everything changed. Clara was helping organize books in the family library when she noticed a newspaper left on a table. Her eyes froze on a familiar name, Henry Blackwood. The article reported that Lady Victoria Blackwood had died after a long illness. Clara stood motionless as she read every line. Henry was now a widower. The news awakened memories she had spent years trying to bury. That evening she could not sleep. She told herself that Henry's life no longer mattered to her. Yet she found herself wondering whether he was happy, whether he regretted what he had done, whether he even remembered the young servant girl he had once promised to marry. A week later, another article appeared. This one announced that Henry Blackwood had inherited an even larger fortune after his father's death. He was now one of the wealthiest men in the region. Clara folded the newspaper and placed it aside. The contrast between their lives seemed almost cruel. He lived surrounded by wealth and respect while she struggled, each day to secure a future for their daughter. As Clara watched Grace sleeping that night, she made herself another promise. Her child would never know who her father was. Some secrets, she believed, were better left buried forever. But fate was already preparing a very different future for them both. In 1878, the springtime gently arrived in London, bringing rain and mist. Clara often strolled home after work, holding Grace's hand over cobblestone streets. Life now felt steady, but there was still fear each morning as Grace asked questions about the world. Clinging to books, Clara and Grace shared afternoons by the fire. A letter arrived at Clara's place of work, addressed to the lady of the house. Hiding the letter, she realized it was about a charity event hosted by Blackwood Hall for various causes. It stirred memories of childhood when Clara had tried to forget. On that day, raining and alone, Clara sat watching rain, thinking of Blackwood Hall, a distant dream. A week later, Mrs. Whitmore visited with a prize letter. She revealed that Grace had been selected for a scholarship at a prestigious school, thanks to her teacher's submission. Tearful, Clara explained that 6 years ago, She had dreamt of giving her daughter opportunities she never had. Then she saw another chance. As the scholarship event was during the charity gala at Blackwood Hall, uncertain, Clara sat watching Grace prepare for the journey. As dawn broke, the city rooftops sparkled, and Clara could feel her uneasy certainty growing. The long-awaited day of returning to Blackwood Hall was soon approaching. 6 years after leaving, the journey from London to Blackwood Hall began beneath a sky the color of silver. Early morning mist drifted across the railway station as passengers hurried along the platform carrying trunks, parcels, and carpetbags. Steam billowed from the waiting locomotive, rising into the cold air like clouds from some great iron beast. Grace stood close to Clara, her eyes wide with excitement. She had never traveled so far from the city before. To her, the entire adventure felt like the beginning of a story from one of her beloved books. Clara forced a smile and squeezed her daughter's hand, though her own heart felt heavy with uncertainty. As the train carried them through the English countryside, fields and villages passed beyond the window like scenes from a painting. Ancient church towers rose above quiet towns. Sheep grazed peacefully on distant hills. Small cottages stood beside winding lanes lined with budding trees. Clara remembered traveling this same route years earlier. Then she had been a hopeful young girl searching for work. Now she was returning as a mother, carrying secrets she had guarded for more than 6 years. By late afternoon, the train arrived at the nearest town. A carriage waited to transport guests to Blackwood Hall. Grace sat beside the window and gazed at everything they passed. The roads curved through green countryside, washed with the soft light of spring. As they approached the estate, Clara felt her breath catch. The great manor emerged beyond rows of ancient oaks, exactly as she remembered it. Its stone walls glowed golden beneath the fading sunlight. Tall chimneys rose into the evening sky. Elegant gardens stretched across the grounds. For a moment, it seemed as though time itself had stood still. Yet Clara knew that nothing was truly the same. Servants welcomed arriving guests through the grand entrance. The familiar scent of polished wood and burning fireplaces filled the air. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead while gentlemen and ladies moved through the halls in expensive evening attire. Grace stared in amazement. She had never seen such luxury. Clara tried to focus only on the scholarship ceremony. They would attend the event, receive Grace's award, and return to London. Nothing more. That was the plan, she repeated silently to herself. As twilight deepened outside, the gathering began. A string quartet played softly in one of the drawing rooms while guests mingled beside glowing fireplaces. The atmosphere felt warm and elegant, yet Clara could not escape a growing sense of unease. Every corridor held memories. Every doorway reminded her of another life. Then she saw him. Henry Blackwood stood near the far end of the room, speaking with several guests. For a moment the sounds around her seemed to disappear. 6 years had passed, yet she recognized him instantly. There were faint traces of age upon his face now. His expression seemed quieter than she remembered. More thoughtful, more burdened, as though sorrow had visited him as faithfully as it had visited her. Henry turned slightly. His eyes moved across the crowded room. Then they found hers. Time seemed to stop. Neither spoke. Neither moved. Across the distance of 6 years and countless regrets, they simply stared at one another. Clara felt her pulse racing. She had imagined this moment many times, yet nothing had prepared her for the reality of it. And as Henry slowly began walking toward her through the crowd, she realized that the past she had fought so hard to leave Behind was finally catching up with them both. For several long moments, neither Clara nor Henry moved. Around them, the charity gathering continued as if nothing unusual had happened. Gentle music drifted through the drawing room. Crystal glasses sparkled beneath the chandeliers. Guests laughed softly beside the fireplaces, while servants moved quietly among them carrying silver trays. Yet for Clara, the entire room seemed to fade into the background. There was only Henry standing before her after 6 years of silence. He stopped a few steps away. The confident young gentleman she had once known seemed gone. In his place stood a man marked by time and disappointment. His dark eyes carried a sadness she had never seen before. Clara felt 100 emotions rise within her at once: anger, pain, confusion, memories. She had spent years burying beneath work and responsibility. Before either could speak, Grace looked up curiously at the stranger. Henry's gaze shifted toward the child. Something in his expression softened immediately. "Good evening," he said gently. "You must be Miss Grace." The little girl smiled politely. "Yes, sir." Clara felt her heart tighten. Henry had no idea who stood before him. He saw only a bright child attending a scholarship ceremony. He did not see his daughter. He did not know that every feature of her face carried traces of both their lives. Henry looked back at Clara. "May I speak with you?" he asked quietly. Clara hesitated. Every instinct told her to walk away. Yet another part of her knew this moment had been waiting for years. She turned to Mrs. Whitmore, who had accompanied them to the event, and asked her to stay with Grace for a few minutes. The older woman nodded kindly. Without another word, Clara followed Henry from the crowded room. They walked through familiar corridors lined with portraits of Blackwood ancestors. Oil lamps flickered against polished wood paneling. The distant sounds of conversation gradually faded behind them. At last, Henry stopped near the old library, the very room where they had first met. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows. The fire burned quietly in the hearth, filling the room with a warm golden glow. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Henry broke the silence. "I have imagined this conversation for years," he said. Clara folded her hands tightly. "And yet you never wrote." The words came more sharply than she intended. Henry lowered his eyes. "I wrote many letters." Clara stared at him. "What?" "I wrote dozens of them." His voice was filled with regret. "After you left, I tried to find you. I sent letters to your village. I received no reply. Eventually, I was told your family had moved away." Clara felt the room tilt slightly around her. "I never received a single letter." Henry looked genuinely stunned. For several moments, neither spoke. The years of silence suddenly seemed less simple than either had believed. The fire crackled softly between them. Outside, evening rain continued to fall across the estate. Finally, Henry spoke again. "Clara, there is something I have wanted to tell you for a very long time. Not a day has passed that I have not regretted what happened." Clara looked away toward the rain-covered windows. The old wounds inside her heart had never fully healed. Yet hearing those words stirred emotions she could not easily name. Somewhere beyond the library walls, Grace was waiting, unaware that the man speaking beside the fire was her father. And as Henry took a slow breath, preparing to reveal more of the truth about those lost years, Clara realized that the story she believed she understood was only beginning to unfold. The fire crackled softly in the library as silence settled between them. Clara stood near the window, watching rain slide down the glass. Henry remained beside the hearth, his face illuminated by the warm glow of the flames. For years she had imagined what she would say if they ever met again. She had rehearsed angry speeches during lonely nights in London. Yet now that the moment had arrived, the words felt strangely distant. "You married her," Clara finally said. Henry lowered his eyes. Yes. The single word carried a weight that seemed to fill the room. "I was weak," he continued quietly. "My father threatened everything. The estate, the family name, my inheritance. I convinced myself I would find a way to bring you back later. But every day it became more difficult. Then Victoria's family became involved, and before I realized it, my life no longer belonged to me." Clara felt old pain stirring inside her. "And what about my life?" she asked. Henry looked at her with visible regret. "There is not a day that passes that I do not ask myself that same question." Outside, thunder rolled faintly across the countryside. The library seemed smaller than before, filled with memories neither of them could escape. For a long moment, Henry studied her face. "You look different," he said softly. "Older." A sad smile touched Clara's lips. "Life has a way of doing that. So does sorrow." His answer surprised her. She had expected excuses, defenses, pride. Instead, she saw only a tired man carrying years of guilt. The firelight flickered across the rows of books that lined the walls. Somewhere in the manor, a clock chimed the hour. Then Henry spoke again. "The little girl, Grace." Clara immediately felt her pulse quicken. "What about her?" A faint smile appeared on his face. "She seems remarkable, intelligent, kind. You must be very proud." Clara nodded. "She is everything too." "Me." Henry looked toward the doorway as though imagining the child waiting elsewhere in the house. "How old is she?" For a brief second, Clara froze. The question hung in the air. 6, she answered carefully. Something shifted in Henry's expression. A calculation. A thought? A possibility. He said nothing, but Clara noticed the sudden uncertainty in his eyes. Before either could continue, a servant knocked gently on the door. "The scholarship presentation is about to begin, sir." Henry thanked him. The interruption broke the tension that had been building between them. Together they walked back through the corridor toward the grand hall where guests were gathering beneath crystal chandeliers. As they entered, Clara immediately spotted Grace standing beside Mrs. Whitmore. The little girl waved excitedly. Henry's gaze followed hers. For several seconds, he watched Grace with unusual attention. Then the child smiled. And for the first time, Henry noticed something that made his heart skip. The shape of her eyes. The familiar expression. A reflection of someone he had once loved. The applause echoed through the grand hall as Grace accepted her scholarship certificate. Candlelight shimmered across crystal chandeliers, and the polished floor reflected the warm glow of hundreds of lamps. Guests smiled politely, while the little girl curtsied with surprising confidence. Clara watched with pride, yet unease lingered in her heart. Across the room, Henry's eyes never seemed to leave Grace. As the ceremony ended, groups of guests gathered around fireplaces and refreshment tables. Gentle music drifted through the manor, while rain continued to fall beyond the tall windows. Grace hurried back to Clara, clutching her certificate. "Mama, did you see?" she asked excitedly. "I saw everything," Clara replied, kissing her forehead. For a moment, she allowed herself to forget the past and enjoy her daughter's happiness. Then Henry approached. "Congratulations, Miss Grace," he said warmly. The child smiled. "Thank you, sir." You must be very proud of her, Henry said to Clara. I am. Grace looked curiously between them. Do you know Mr. Blackwood, Mama? The question caught Clara off guard. Henry remained silent. We met many years ago, Clara answered carefully. Grace seemed satisfied by the explanation, but Henry's expression changed slightly. It was as though each small detail only deepened the questions forming in his mind. A servant soon announced that carriages would be available for guests wishing to stay overnight at nearby inns because of the late hour and worsening weather. Mrs. Whitmore accepted an invitation for her small group to remain at Blackwood Hall until morning. Clara's heart sank. One more night beneath this roof. One more night surrounded by memories. Later, after Grace had fallen asleep in a guest room overlooking the gardens, Clara stood alone beside a window. Moonlight filtered through drifting clouds, illuminating the wet paths below. The estate looked peaceful, almost unchanged from the days of her youth. A gentle knock sounded behind her. She turned. Henry stood in the doorway. I apologize for disturbing you, he said quietly. Clara did not answer. For several moments neither spoke. Then Henry stepped closer. Clara, I need to ask you something. She immediately knew what was coming. His voice was calm, but she could hear uncertainty beneath it. Grace is 6 years old. Yes, you arrived in London shortly after leaving Blackwood Hall. Clara felt her pulse quicken. The silence stretched between them. Finally, Henry looked directly into her eyes. Is Grace my daughter? Outside, wind stirred through the trees surrounding the manor. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the countryside. Clara stood frozen. For years she had feared this exact moment. And now there was no escaping it. The truth that had remained hidden for 6 long years was finally standing between them. Henry's question lingered in the room long after the words had been spoken. Outside, rain tapped softly against the window panes, and the branches of ancient trees swayed beneath the restless wind. Clara felt as though the years between them had suddenly disappeared. Every sacrifice, every hardship, every lonely night in London now stood beside her like silent witnesses. Henry waited patiently, his face pale in the moonlight. He already seemed to know the answer. Clara looked away toward the dark gardens below. For 6 years, she had protected Grace from the truth. She had convinced herself that secrecy was necessary. Yet, standing here now, she wondered whether she had truly been protecting her daughter, or simply protecting herself from reopening old wounds. At last she spoke. Yes. The single word barely rose above a whisper. Henry closed his eyes. For a moment he seemed unable to breathe. When he opened them again, they were filled with emotion. He moved toward a nearby chair and sat down heavily, as though the weight of the revelation had stolen his strength. Neither spoke. The crackling fire and distant rain filled the silence. Finally, Henry looked up. My daughter? The words sounded unfamiliar on his lips. Clara could see countless thoughts passing through his mind. Joy, shock, regret, wonder. 6 years of missed birthdays. 6 years of stories never heard and memories never shared. Why didn't you tell me? He asked quietly. Clara's expression hardened. Tell you? She repeated. You married another woman. You let me leave. You never came for me. Henry lowered his head. He could not deny any of it. I believed you had chosen your future, Clara continued, and I was forced to build mine. Tears glistened in her eyes, but her voice remained steady. When Grace was born, she was all I had. Every decision I made was for her. Henry listened without interruption. The truth of her words struck deeper than any accusation. He thought of the years spent in grand rooms and elegant estates, the wealth, the privilege, the comforts that had surrounded him. Meanwhile, Clara had faced poverty, loneliness, and motherhood entirely alone. A profound shame settled over him. At last he rose and walked slowly toward the window. The moon briefly emerged from behind the clouds, casting silver light across the gardens of Blackwood Hall. "Can she ever know?" he asked. Clara remained silent. She did not know the answer. Grace's life had been built upon one version of the past. Changing it could alter everything. Down the corridor, a grandfather clock began striking midnight. Each chime seemed to echo through the old manor like a reminder of lost years. Henry turned back toward her. "Whatever happens next," he said softly, "I will not abandon her again." Clara studied his face. She wanted to believe him. Once, long ago, she had believed every promise he made. The difference was that now she had far more to lose. The footsteps outside the library grew louder before the door slowly opened. Clara and Henry immediately stepped apart. An elderly woman entered carrying a candle lamp whose golden light danced across the dark wood paneling. Clara recognized her at once. It was Mrs. Abernathy, the former housekeeper of Blackwood Hall. Time had added silver to her hair, but her sharp eyes remained unchanged. For a moment, surprise filled the older woman's face. Then her expression softened. "Forgive me," she said quietly. "I did not realize the room was occupied." Henry nodded politely. But Mrs. Abernathy did not leave. Instead, she looked carefully at Clara. "Miss Evans," she said. After all these years, Clara offered a small smile. "Mrs. Abernathy," the older woman seemed genuinely pleased to see her. "I often wondered what became of you." An uncomfortable silence followed. Mrs. Abernathy glanced between them and seemed to understand more than either wished to explain. Then she sighed heavily. "Perhaps it is time certain truths were finally spoken." Henry frowned. "What do you mean?" The housekeeper hesitated before answering. Rain continued tapping against the windows while the fire crackled softly nearby. At last she placed the lamp upon a table. "The letters," she said. "The letters you sent after Miss Evans left." Henry straightened immediately. "What about them?" Mrs. Abernathy lowered her eyes. "They never reached her." Clara felt her breath catch. Henry stared in disbelief. "How do you know that?" For several moments the older woman seemed reluctant to continue. Then she spoke. "Because I saw what happened." The room fell completely silent. "Your father intercepted them." Henry's face turned pale. Clara stood frozen. The words seemed impossible and yet strangely believable. Mrs. Abernathy continued softly. "I was present one afternoon when several letters arrived. They were addressed to Miss Evans. Your father ordered them brought to his study. I assumed he intended to forward them later. Instead," she paused, "he burned them." Henry closed his eyes. Clara could hardly move. For years she had believed Henry had abandoned her completely. For years Henry had believed Clara had chosen never to answer. Both had built their lives upon a lie created by another person. The firelight flickered across Henry's face as the realization settled upon him. His father had not merely separated them. He had stolen their chance to understand one another, their chance to choose their own future. Outside, the storm began to fade. Moonlight slowly emerged between drifting clouds and illuminated the wet gardens below. Mrs. Abernathy looked toward Clara. "I should have spoken sooner," she whispered. "I have regretted my silence for many years." No one answered. The truth was too large, too painful, too late. Yet, as Clara looked toward Henry, she saw something change in his eyes. For the first time since their reunion, the wall of uncertainty between them had begun to crack. Morning arrived quietly over Blackwood Hall. Pale sunlight filtered through thin layers of mist that drifted across the gardens and stone pathways. The storm had passed during the night, leaving the countryside washed clean beneath a soft silver sky. From the windows of the manor, the lawns sparkled with droplets of rain, and birds sang among the ancient oak trees that surrounded the estate. To many, it seemed like a peaceful morning. Yet for Clara, sleep had brought little rest. The revelations of the previous evening continued to circle through her thoughts. The letters, the years of misunderstanding, the possibility that everything might have unfolded differently. She sat beside the guest room fireplace as the last embers faded, wondering how many lives had been altered by choices made long ago. Across the room, Grace slowly awakened. The little girl stretched beneath her blanket and smiled. "It is beautiful here," she said softly. Clara returned the smile. "Yes, it is." Grace moved to the window and gazed across the gardens. "Mr. Blackwood seems kind." Clara's heart tightened. "Why do you say that?" Grace thought for a moment. "When he speaks to me, he looks happy." Clara could find no answer. Later that morning, guests gathered in the breakfast room where sunlight reflected from polished silver and fine china. Gentle conversation filled the air while servants moved quietly between tables. Grace sat beside Mrs. Whitmore, listening eagerly to stories about the countryside. Henry entered a few moments later. The instant his eyes found Grace, Clara noticed the warmth in his expression. He greeted the guests politely, but his attention often drifted back toward the child. As the meal ended, Grace asked permission to explore the gardens. Mrs. Whitmore agreed to accompany her. Soon they disappeared through the glass doors leading outside. Clara watched them leave, relieved to have a moment of privacy. Henry approached her cautiously. "I would like to know her," he said. Clara looked down at her hands. "You cannot simply appear in her life and expect everything to change." "I know." His voice was gentle. "But she is my daughter." The words still sounded strange after so many years. Clara remained silent. Part of her wanted to protect Grace from uncertainty. Another part knew that a child deserved the truth. Before either could continue, a servant entered carrying a small wooden box. "This was discovered in the attic during renovations, sir," he explained. "Among some of your father's belongings." Henry accepted it with curiosity. The box was old and covered in dust. Slowly he opened the lid. Inside lay a bundle of yellowed letters tied with faded ribbon. Clara's breath caught immediately. She recognized the handwriting. Her own letters she had written to Henry after leaving Blackwood Hall. Letters she believed had vanished forever. Neither spoke as the truth settled between them once more. His letters had never reached her. Hers had never reached him. Henry sat in silence as he read the letters one by one. The breakfast room had long since emptied, and only the quiet ticking of a clock disturbed the stillness. Clara remained across from him, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the faded pages that had spent years hidden in darkness. Every letter carried the voice of a young woman who had believed herself abandoned. Henry read of Clara's journey to London, her fears, her loneliness, and the desperate hope that he might somehow answer. He read words written through tears and uncertainty. Words that had never reached him. When he finished the final page, he carefully set the letters down. His eyes were filled with sorrow. "I would have come for you," he said quietly. Clara looked away. Part of her believed him now. The evidence lay before them. Yet believing did not erase 6 years of hardship. It did not return the lost time. Outside, the gardens glowed beneath the gentle spring sun. Grace could be seen in the distance walking beside Mrs. Whitmore among rows of blooming flowers. Neither child nor mother had imagined that this visit would uncover so many buried truths. Henry followed Clara's gaze toward the garden. "She deserves to know someday." Clara nodded slowly. Perhaps. The answer frightened her more than she wished to admit. Grace had grown up with a simple understanding of the world. Revealing the truth would change that forever. During the afternoon, Henry spent several hours with Grace in the gardens. They fed ducks beside a small pond and wandered through pathways lined with roses. Clara watched from a distance. To her surprise, Grace seemed immediately comfortable with him. They laughed together easily. At one point, Henry showed her how to skip small stones across the water. The sight filled Clara with both warmth and sadness. She could not help wondering what their lives might have been if fate had shown greater kindness. As evening approached, dark clouds gathered once again above the countryside. A light rain began to fall, tapping softly against the glass roof of the conservatory, where the guests took shelter. Grace sat beside Henry, showing him a book she carried everywhere. He listened attentively as she read aloud. The resemblance between them seemed impossible to ignore now. Even Mrs. Whitmore noticed it. When Grace finally left to prepare for bed, the room grew quiet. Henry turned toward Clara. "I cannot change the past," he said, "but I want to be part of her future." Clara studied him carefully. The young man who had once feared losing his inheritance was gone. In his place stood someone who had spent years living with regret. For the first time, she saw sincerity rather than promises. Yet before she could answer, Grace appeared in the doorway. The child looked unusually thoughtful. "Mama," she said softly, "may I ask something?" Clara immediately sensed what was coming. Grace looked from her to Henry. "Why do I feel as though I have known Mr. Blackwood much longer than one day?" The room fell silent. Outside, rain whispered against the glass, while twilight settled over Blackwood Hall. The moment Clara had feared for years had finally arrived, and with it came a choice that would shape all of their lives forever. The room remained silent after Grace's question. Outside, evening rain drifted softly across the glass roof of the conservatory. The last light of day faded beyond the gardens of Blackwood Hall, and lanterns were being lit throughout the estate. Clara looked at her daughter and realized that the moment she had feared for so many years could no longer be delayed. Children often understood more than adults imagined. Grace had sensed the truth long before anyone had spoken it aloud. Henry remained still, allowing Clara to decide. It was her choice. It had always been her choice. Clara slowly reached for Grace's hand. The little girl looked up with curious eyes. "There is something I should have told you long ago," Clara said gently. Grace listened carefully. "Mr. Blackwood is not only my old friend." Clara paused. Her voice trembled slightly. "He is your father." For a moment, Grace simply stared at them both. The words seemed too large to understand all at once. Then her eyes moved toward Henry. He knelt beside her chair. The wealthy owner of Blackwood Hall, the man who commanded estates and fortunes, suddenly looked more nervous than he ever had in his life. "Hello, Grace," he said softly. I suppose I should have introduced myself properly. The little girl studied him for several seconds. Then she asked the question only a child would think to ask. Will you disappear again? Clara felt tears rise instantly. Henry's eyes filled with emotion. Never, he answered. Not if you will have me. Grace considered this very seriously. Then she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. Henry held his daughter. For the first time while rain whispered against the glass, and twilight settled over the old manor, Clara watched them together and felt a weight lift from her heart. The past could never be changed. The years they had lost would never return. Yet perhaps the future still held room for happiness. In the months that followed, many things changed. Henry became a constant presence in Grace's life. Clara and Grace visited Blackwood Hall often. The grand manor no longer felt like a place of heartbreak. Slowly it became a place of healing. As for Clara and Henry, trust returned more slowly than love. Time had taught them caution, but it had also taught them what truly mattered. By the autumn of 1880, beneath golden leaves and a sky brushed with soft afternoon light, they were married in a small country church. There were no grand announcements in newspapers, no wealthy arrangements between powerful families, only a quiet gathering of people who genuinely cared for them. Mrs. Whitmore attended, Mrs. Abernathy attended, and Grace stood proudly beside her parents, smiling brighter than anyone else. Years later, when winter evenings settled over Blackwood Hall and fires glowed warmly within the hearths, Clara would often sit beside the drawing room fireplace with her family. The flames danced across the room, while wind rustled through the ancient trees outside. Sometimes she would think of the frightened young servant girl who had once arrived at the estate with a single suitcase and no certainty about her future. She could never have imagined where life would lead, and perhaps that was the lesson of her story. Even in the darkest seasons, hope can survive. Even after loss, new beginnings can arrive. And sometimes the path that seems broken forever is simply leading somewhere unexpected.com. Thank you for spending this quiet Victorian evening beside the fire. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to subscribe for more relaxing tales from Victorian England, filled with candlelit manors, foggy streets, railway journeys, gentle mysteries, and timeless stories to accompany peaceful nights by the fireplace.